Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started. This has been a good week. Tech finally won a game, and we've had a super good rain and extra hour of sleep. So it's a good time to, on this cool, foggy morning, to come and worship God. Almost forgot it. Uh, Need to remember the progressive dinner that will be the 16th, I believe it is. And they will have appetizers and here, and then they'll go somewhere for a meal and then come back for a dessert. So there's a code that you can scan and sign up, or you can get it off the church website, or you can call Lisa Rainey. And but anyway, she's encouraging everyone to participate in that, and it's a lot of fun. We've been to them, and you get to know other people and enjoy it. Let's go to our Father in prayer. Heavenly Father, we're grateful to you for the great blessings that you always bestow upon us, and we're so thankful for the rain that you have blessed us with. We just thank you for the many things that you always do for us, and be with Richard as he presents the lesson to us today, and just continue to go with us and guide us. In his name we ask. Amen.
Welcome to our class this morning. We're beginning a new study today that will go through the end of this year. 6 lessons, it's planned. It's going to be about the life of Joseph. I always feel awkward when certain lessons or series are assigned to us, because I always think of someone else who's that's their study. And I almost feel like we ought to invite Nat Cooper in here and just have him do this instead. But he's otherwise engaged, and it gives some of us other fellows the chance to practice on you. Joseph. Let's talk a little bit about the background to where we're going to be this morning. We're actually going to be in Genesis chapter 37. That's where the story of Joseph particularly begins. But when we say Genesis 37, the first thing we notice is Genesis. Why is Genesis called Genesis? Anybody know? In the beginning. There's even a more fundamental reason than that. I mean, they're tied together, of course, but the first 3 words of the book. In English, in the beginning. In the Hebrew, the original of this, that's how it also begins. And so the Jewish people in their time would often name their books after the first word or two that appeared at the beginning of it. And so it just says beginning. But why is it called beginning? Well, it's the beginning of the world. You know that much. Creation. Everything we know that we call this world, and even beyond that, this universe. But it's more than that. Yes, Jerry? Beginning of the Israelites? Yes. It is a book of beginnings with S on the end of it, actually. It's the beginning of man's rebellion against God, Adam and Eve. It's the beginning of God's plan to redeem man. It's the beginning of the Israelite nation. It's the beginning of the family of Abraham. In fact, when we look at the book, roughly speaking, the book sort of divides into 2 big parts. Genesis 1 through about 11, and then Genesis 12 through the rest of the book. The first 11 chapters roughly presents us with a creation, and with Adam and Eve, and the introduction of the Satan, or the one who comes and tempts them, and the fall, and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, but at the same time God's promise that one day the head of that serpent would be crushed through one of the descendants of Eve. Then after they're expelled from the garden, we have our first murder. When they have children, 2 sons, one kills the other. And he is driven out from there, and gradually we see the earth being populated, but the earth is getting more and more wicked. It's not getting better and better. It's getting worse and worse. Finally, God says he's going to destroy all mankind, except he provides an ark of safety in Noah. So we have the great flood with Noah. Then after the flood is over, Noah and his family began to repopulate the earth. What happens? Same thing over again. It gets worse and worse. People multiply, and they say, we're going to be great, and so we're going to build our own tower up to heaven. Almost in perhaps some idea that they could reach up to God on their own, instead of realizing that it takes God reaching down to us. And so God confuses their language, and they end up, because they can no longer communicate with each other, and except in smaller size groups, they sort of start finally scattering out over the earth again like he told them to do. And at that point, the story picks up towards the end of chapter 11 with the story of one of Noah's sons, who, as he and his family moved to another part of the earth, actually to an area called Ur of the Chaldees, they have descendants and descendants and descendants until we're finally introduced to a man by the name of Abram. And then with chapter 12, the story shifts from what's happening with all the people on earth to what's happening to this one man and his family. And so from 12 through 50, we have 4 generations of Abraham's family. Abraham, and then who comes next? Isaac, his son, one of his sons. And then who comes next? Jacob, one of Isaac's sons. And then, starting in chapter 37 and going through the end of the book, is our 4th generation, one of the sons of Jacob named Joseph. Joseph and his story actually takes up more space in Genesis than any of the others. Moses, when he wrote this, and even Jesus said that Moses wrote this, Moses is telling a story to who? We think it's for us, but not, or we weren't the original audience. Who was he writing this to originally? Those Israelites who had come up out of captivity in Egypt and are in the wilderness and will be there for 40 years. And we don't know exactly where in that process Moses is writing this, but we know they're the audience. And he's having to tell them their own history. They've lost that. They don't understand who they are and why they are. But more than that, they don't realize the role God plays in all of it. And so the story of Genesis is a story of God taking a rebellious, sinful people, starting from the very beginning, and in his grace and his mercy, carrying out his plan that he had started out promising in the garden, and that he expands on when he first starts talking in detail to Abram or Abraham. And so when we look in Genesis chapter 12, we hear it saying this: the Lord had said to Abram. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God makes this great promise to Abram. He'll repeat this promise to Isaac later. It'll be repeated again in a little different form to Jacob. These are the people that God's going to make into the great nation, but more than that, these are the people through whom God's going to bless all the rest of the people on earth. This is the beginning of what culminates in our New Testament with Jesus, a descendant of Abraham, the one that God was really talking about when he tells Abram this promise way back then. So we're down to the fourth generation when we get to chapter 37. And Joseph's been mentioned a couple of times already in the book when he's born. And when he and his family leave Haran, where they had been living and where he had been born, and come back down into this land that God had given to Abraham. But the story really starts focusing on Joseph here. You know, you might think if the book spends this much time on Joseph that we would hear a lot about him all the rest of the way through the rest of the Bible, and that's really not quite true. It's not that he's not important, but just the way the story plays out. But I went and looked. Do you know Joseph is actually mentioned in the New Testament? I believe I counted in 4 different places he's talked about. So he is mentioned in the New Testament. In the Gospels, when Jesus is meeting the woman at the well, it actually explains that this is Jacob's well, but it's on the property that Jacob had given Joseph, it says. Interesting, it just sort of mentions that. And of course, all the Jewish people would know what he was talking about. We find that Stephen, when he's preaching his great sermon in the book of Acts, he devotes a number of verses, and the way our Bibles are divided up, to talking about Joseph and how God used him to save his people. It'll be mentioned again in the book of Hebrews as one of those great heroes of faith. And then last of all, he's actually mentioned in the book of Revelation, but only sort of in passing. You might remember that passage where it will say that it'll name the 12 tribes, and it names each one of them. It says 12,000, 12,000. Well, Joseph is one of the ones named. It mentions 12,000. But what you might be surprised to know is that Joseph's not the only person, even in the New Testament, named Joseph. Oh, well, maybe you already figured that out, you know. What was the father of Jesus? Joseph. But that Joseph and our Joseph is one of only 9 different Josephs that are named in the New Testament. And you know, I have this fascination about words and looking them up. My concordance is my favorite book because it allows me to look up how many times every which word or name appears. But there's 9 different Josephs mentioned in the New Testament, including our Joseph and Jesus' father named Joseph, but then 7 others besides that. You'll have to go look them up yourself. Okay, let's look at the passage now. Genesis 37 says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. The author, Moses, as he says this, is reminding his first listeners what's happened here, because Jacob hasn't been living in this land. He had moved away years ago because of a conflict with his brother, and even was afraid his brother would kill him if he stayed anywhere close by. So he had actually gone back to where the family had come from, where Abram had come from, up in Haran, and had lived there a number of years. But now he's back, and he's in the land of Canaan. And it says, this is the account of Jacob. That's interesting. It says that, and then it immediately proceeds to talk about Joseph. Because if the story ended with Jacob, then everything's lost. Unless the story continues with Jacob's offspring, and in particular, it's going to be this one. It says, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Time to reveal the family secret here. Joseph lives in a very dysfunctional family. He lives in a very dysfunctional family that comes from a whole line of dysfunctional families. Abraham, our hero of faith, was not exactly a sterling individual on all occasions, was he? And the two things that really often stands out to us is two different times when he was in the presence of other people who were very powerful. He would not even tell them that this woman who was with him was his wife. He would tell them, she's my sister. And so then they would say, man, she's beautiful. I would like to add her to my harem. And Abram would just says, here she is. That happened twice. That wouldn't have happened more than once in my family. Not only would I not be married, I wouldn't be alive. But cultural and other things, somewhat different. But Abram, on two different occasions, in a sense, disowned his own wife because he wanted to save his own skin, he thought. Well, they couldn't have children. God had promised he would, but they didn't. They didn't, and they didn't, and they didn't. And finally, his wife, Sarah, said, well, here's my handmaiden, the servant who serves me and takes care of me. Abram was quite a wealthy man, so they could afford servants. Said, why don't you just take her and sleep with her, and I'll just claim the child she has. Again, that wouldn't have flown in my family, but in the ancient times, people thought differently and acted differently. And so that's what happened. Abram actually slept with his wife's maidservant, and she had a child. And Abram loved that child. It was his son, Ishmael. But now, what do you think the wife thinks about it? Now she's jealous. And later, I'm not sure exactly how many years, probably 10 to 12 years later, finally God fulfilled his promise and Sarah gets pregnant. And when that child is born, his name is Isaac. But now Sarah's really jealous because Abram has already been doting over this other son, and Sarah's handmaiden is getting a little uppity because she's had a child for the master and Sarah hasn't. And so Sarah actually runs her off. Not a pretty picture. Isaac grows up, gets married. Sarah passes away. Eventually, Abraham passes away. Isaac takes a wife named Rebecca. And as things go along, and all of a sudden, here's somebody making eyes at his wife. What does he do? Hey, you can have her. Same thing his father had done, even though Isaac wasn't even alive when that had happened. But he and Rebekah have two sons, Esau and Jacob. Two men as different as night and day. At a certain point, Isaac is old. His eyesight has failed him. It's time for him to, start arranging for the next generation, passing on the blessing to the firstborn and all of that. And Rebekah sort of gets on the side with Jacob because she favored him the most, while Isaac really favored Esau the most. And they come up with a scheme whereby when Isaac is ready to give the blessing, Esau hadn't gotten in from the field yet or out hunting. And so Jacob shows up, feeds his dad his favorite meal, and has disguised himself so that when his dad smells of him and feels of him, he smells like and feels like Esau, even though his voice doesn't sound like Esau. And so Isaac gives him the blessing. Deceit. Of course, this is the beginning of the real conflict between Jacob and Esau. So off goes Jacob back up to Haran, where Rebekah's brother lived, a man by the name of Laban. And so Jacob gets up there, meets Laban, meets Laban's daughter, Rachel, and she's beautiful. And he said, "Hey, I'm single and available," and turns out she is too. So he strikes a deal with his soon-to-be father-in-law and says, "Look, I don't have anything else, but I'll work for you for 7 years in exchange for your daughter Rachel." So they make the deal, and whenever the 7 years is up, the wedding is held. And of course, their culture is very different than ours, as near as we know. I mean, there wasn't all this dating and two people alone together for extended periods of time as part of the dating relationship. The women often wore veils where you couldn't even see what their face looked like on important occasions, and so forth. And so they have the wedding party and the ceremony and so forth. And so the new husband and wife go into the tent together and consummate the marriage. The next morning when it gets daylight, and for the first time he actually in broad daylight can see what his new wife looks like. It's one of the most profound statements in the entire Bible. In Genesis chapter 29, it says, "When morning came, there was Leah." He'd just gotten married to the older sister of Rachel and has consummated the marriage relationship with her. And so he comes flying out of that tent looking for his father-in-law. The man of deceit, Jacob, had just been outdone by his uncle and his father-in-law. And so they strike another deal that if after the 7 days or 10 days or what it was of the newlyweds were to have together, then Laban would give him Rachel for another 7 years of work. And this begins a crisis in the family, because even though they're sisters, Leah and Rachel, Jacob loved one much more than he loved the other. And he always made that obvious. Each one of them had a handmaiden. Before it's all over with, that we just saw there in Genesis 37, Jacob ends up having children by both Leah and Rachel, as well as their two handmaidens, Bilhah and Zilpah. And they end up having a big family. How many kids did they have? Anybody remember how many kids they had altogether? 13. 12 boys and 1 girl. You reckon that girl was spoiled? We don't actually know that, but I'm afraid I have to think of another family, a missionary family we know that's got 8 children, 7 boys and 1 girl. And the girl's right in the very middle. That's where we are in this story. So we've got Jacob's great-grandfather, who's been less than honest all the time, deceitful. We've had his grandfather, Isaac, who's been less than honest all the time. Now we've got his father, who is the master of deceit. In many, many stories we could tell here, but don't have the time for it. And now we have Joseph, this young man, next to the youngest son, and one of only two children that Rachel, the favored wife, was able to have for Jacob. It's Joseph and his younger brother, who's about maybe 11 years younger than him, something like that it seems. And his name was Benjamin. And Rachel actually died in childbirth having Benjamin. So all these other sons of Jacob that we're going to be hearing about here, none of them are Joseph's full brothers. They're all half-brothers. And they're all half-brothers who grew up in a family knowing that their father, their common father, loved Joseph's mother more than he loved any of their mothers. And as we're about to see, that Joseph got special favors from the father that none of the others got. And so it says, here's Joseph. He's a young man of 17. They are, and they have flocks and herds and so forth. A great number of them because just like starting with Abraham, they were quite wealthy in this particular way. So Joseph, off at 17, is off tending the flocks with his brothers. And while we're not told what his brothers did while they were away at this time, when Joseph came back, he told on them. I don't know what that was they were doing. It doesn't say. But it says he brought their father a bad report about them. Okay. We're going to give a baseball analogy here. Strike one against Joseph. Now it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, next to the youngest son, and so he made a richly ornamented robe for him. Different translations use a different word there for that word ornamented because it's a little unclear in the Hebrew exactly what it means. Some will say multicolored. Some will say one with long sleeves and so forth. Because in different contexts it can mean any of those things. But anyway, it's a robe that none of the others had. And historians and scholars tell us that this robe probably looked like the kind of robe that in their culture a ruler or a leader of people would wear. So Dad's already tipping his hand for the future about who he is considering going to be the firstborn. Even though 10 of them are all older than him. But he's going to be treated like the firstborn. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Strike two. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Now, first of all, many ancient people and even some modern peoples put a lot of stock in dreams and what they mean. And especially that was true in the ancient world. We see it throughout the Old Testament, even some in the New Testament. And they usually saw that as a message from God. And so, don't know whether Joseph's being a little bit getting back at you kind of guy here, or maybe he's just saying, hey, God gave me a dream. I want to tell you about it. Could be he was somewhat naive. But when his brothers heard this, they said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? He's already got the robe of a ruler, and now he's had this dream about them bowing down to him. And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Strike three. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him. But notice this last statement. But his father kept the matter in mind. His father actually takes it seriously, even though he rebukes him for telling them all this and trying to make something of it. It says, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem. Shechem was a kind of an interesting thing because earlier in this story, right after they had first gotten back from Haran, they had camped out near a place called Shechem. And the one daughter, Dinah, had actually left their camp and gone into town to meet the girls, the other young ladies who lived there in that small town, and had met up with, or had met, the son of the ruler of Shechem. And this young man, not a very pretty picture painted of him in some ways. It says he actually took her and violated her. Well, when the rest of the family hears about it, first Jacob learns of what has happened to his daughter, but he does nothing about it. But when the young man then comes and said, "I'd like to marry your daughter," the brothers of Dinah, particularly the ones who had the same mother as she did, which was Leah, they said, "The only way we can let you marry our sister is if you be circumcised like we are." And so they struck a deal, and this young man and every man in the small town was circumcised. And on the third day, while they were all pretty waiting to heal, two of these brothers go into town with their swords and kill every man in town. That was their revenge. And they then looted the town. All the brothers, or at least the other brothers with them, looted the town and took the women as servants or slaves. It's not a very pretty picture. Well, here they are camped out back up there again near that place. And we don't know if the city had been repopulated or what by now, but have to think people in that region up there are not too happy with these guys. So it says, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel, another name for Jacob, said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. Notice how he's actually acting as his father's representative now. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Well, that didn't work out very well last time he did that. So he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. So he's going to travel this long distance. It's about 65 miles on the map from Hebron all the way up to Shechem. Both those places more or less exist even today. But when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. I heard them say, "Let's go to Dothan." That's another 15 miles up north. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance. He stood out like a sore thumb. He was wearing his jacket. He was wearing his special robe from his father. They recognized him from a long way off. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." They said, well, a dream can't come to fruition if the person who's at the center of it is dead. They hated him. And so the first plan was, let's kill him. But Reuben, he's the firstborn of all of them. He was the first child born to Jacob and Leah. But when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Ancient peoples often dug cisterns, holes in the ground where water would flow into it. And while it wouldn't necessarily be good for human consumption, it gave them a place they could water their flocks, when otherwise in that region there might not be a standing water or a good stream or something like that. So here's one very near them. It seemed like this one is dry, or nearly dry at least. And so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, so here's their brother in the cistern. He's crying out and calling out for them to rescue him and cut out the jokes and kidding around and get me out of here, because he couldn't get out of there, kind of thing. But as they've sat down to eat their meal, ignoring him, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So Judah, not Reuben, but Judah, said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." Yeah, after all, he is their brother. So we'll just sell him as a slave instead of leaving him to die in the cistern. That's really brotherly thoughts, isn't it? Well, what his real thought is, we can make some money off of this. We'll get rid of him. Our father won't have him to dote over anymore and hold him over us. He'll be gone, and we'll get a little money out of the deal. We just won't tell Dad what really happened. And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. I guess there's an ancient document somewhere in this period of time, maybe down in Egypt, that indicated that if a man had a slave that was handicapped or injured in some way, he could sell him for as much as 20 shekels. That's all they're going to get for him. But much better was it with Judah and Jesus. He could have asked for a lot more, but he settled for 30. They settled for 20. And when Reuben returned, he apparently for some reason was not with him at the moment when this happened. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" He says, "Where can I find him?" Reuben thinks we're in trouble. If Joseph had gotten himself out and headed back home to Dad, they're all in trouble. If something else has happened to him, if they've somehow killed him when he wasn't there and buried him or something, they're all in trouble. So he says, "Where can I find him? Where can I turn?" Apparently they tell him what the real deal is. But it says, "Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood." Remember when Jacob was young? He put an animal skin on his arm, so when his dad felt it, he would think that he must be Esau, because Esau was a very hairy man, and Jacob was very smooth skinned. That is about to come back on Jacob. So they took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Notice they don't actually say, "Look, we found Joseph's coat or robe." but we didn't find him. Here it is, all torn up and all bloody and everything. They don't actually say that. They just say, "Is this it?" Which they know full well it is. And Jacob recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe." And he draws this conclusion that some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes. That's a sign of great misery or suffering or grief. Put on sackcloth and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. So these men, these brothers of Joseph, all knowing, at least all the older ones, probably Benjamin don't know about Dinah, the daughter, they all know the truth. So they're going to have to live with a lie with their father. And as the rest of the story will be playing out, we'll be looking at over the next 5 weeks after this, it'll be more than 22 years before Jacob will actually learn that his son has been alive all this time. And so these men have to propagate a lie for 22 years and watch their father suffer and grieve for 22 years, knowing that it's all a lie. Meanwhile, the story says, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, a captain of the guard. That's where the story will be picking up from there. Moses writes this entire book, including this story, for the Jewish people to know where they came from and where God fits into all of this. They're hearing, maybe for the first time, that their ancestors have not been sterling, pure people. That they've been people who have been, disobedient to God, that have not been what you would consider perfect examples of what people ought to be, even as God's people. And yet God has this promise He's made. And He's going to be carrying it out, even in spite of what these people do. And it's very interesting at the very end of the book of Genesis. Obviously, the book of Genesis begins with God and God making the earth and everything in it. And at the end of that creation, it says that God saw everything that He made and what? And He saw that it was good. The Hebrew people had a very interesting way of writing stories or telling stories. They would often start a story and end a story with the same words in some form or another. And so at the very end of Genesis, and we're tipping at the hand of what happened at the end, when at last Jacob and the sons are down in Egypt and find out that Joseph has been made a ruler in Egypt and actually saves the whole family. When they are gathered together, in Genesis 50 and verse 19, it says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. I am not in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.'" God made everything and said it was good. At the end of this story, Joseph says, "Look, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good." God's purposes overrule man's purposes all the time. Thank God for that. And we will see that throughout the rest of the Bible. And we still see it at work among God's people even today. Okay, we're going to pick up next week with Joseph in Egypt. We sort of lose sight more or less of what happens with the family back in Canaan for the next 22 years because we'll be following what's happening to Joseph instead. Okay.
Richard, thank you very much for that lesson. We have several on our prayer list. First off is Thanksgiving for the rain, and then prayers for the family of Ron and Joey Rose and Ron's passing. Jack Barton's is having shoulder surgery Monday. Charlotte Bertram is having an angiogram Tuesday. Rosemary Perkins and the loss of her sister. And then Ralda Yoakum is home in her apartment. And then prayers for election on Tuesday. Another Thanksgiving for the rain. Carla Matthews is having lung surgery. Carly Talley, Lorinda Creel, and John and Linda Boger is thanks for the prayers and the well wishes, and they're both recovering. Prayers for our congregation's consistent giving. Jay Warner is in Carolina, 329, I believe, and would love to have visits. And Dennis Maupin at the loss of his mother. And Stuart Jones is going to lead our prayer, and let's remember to stack the chairs.
Let us bow. Our Father, we're thankful for the good opportunity we have to gather together, share fellowship, and to listen to important words from your scriptures. And we ask that you would guide each one of us, that we'll be able to think sensibly, have the courage to follow good paths, and be able to help others around us who may have some difficult problems to deal with. As you would guide our congregation, our school here, that things will continue to go in a very positive direction. And again, we're thankful for the good things you do for us. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.